In the early 1920s, Mollie Maggia went to a dentist in New Jersey with pain around a tooth. The tooth was removed, but the socket would not heal. Soon, the problem was no longer one tooth, and the substance damaging her body was the same luminous material she had repeatedly placed between her lips at work. Maggia had painted watch and instrument dials for the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey. The numbers had to be small and exact. After a few strokes, the bristles of her brush spread apart, so she drew them through her lips to restore a fine point, dipped the brush into luminous paint, and continued. The motion was quick, ordinary, and repeated throughout the day. The paint contained radium. Radium did not enter the 20th century as an obvious industrial poison. Marie and Pierre Curie announced its discovery in 1898, and the element seemed to embody a new scientific age. It released energy without flame. Mixed with zinc sulfide, it could make a surface glow in darkness. In medicine, carefully placed radium sources became a real, if still developing, treatment for certain cancers. Around that legitimate medical work grew a much less disciplined commercial culture. Radium appeared in advertisements for tonics, cosmetics, drinking solutions, and household devices. Some contained measurable radioactive material. Others borrowed the name and imagery of radium while containing little of consequence. Genuine science, experimental medicine, exaggeration, and fraud began sharing the same radiant promise. This was the energy of modern life. Luminous paint, however, had a practical use. During the First World War, soldiers and pilots needed to read watches, compasses, gun sights, and instrument panels without revealing their positions with a lamp. American demand expanded sharply after 1917. When the war ended, glowing watches and clocks moved easily into civilian homes. Factories needed workers capable of painting tiny numerals quickly. Young women were recruited for the job and often paid by the piece. At a good rate, dial painting could offer unusually attractive wages for female factory work. Small brushes conserved an expensive material. Lip pointing produced the precise tip the job demanded. Workers at more than one plant later recalled that supervisors taught or encouraged the technique and assured them the paint was harmless. Some women decorated their nails or clothing with it. Those stories are sometimes retold as evidence of foolishness. They reveal something more important. The people handling the material every day had been given little reason to treat it as a serious threat. Radium specialists already knew that concentrated sources could burn tissue and that prolonged external exposure required care. Laboratories used distance, shielding, containers, and instruments to control radiation. But knowing that concentrated radium could damage tissue was not the same as understanding what tiny, swallowed doses would do inside a worker's body years later. Early medical literature contained warnings, theories, and contradictory claims. Some researchers suspected that radium might remain inside the body. Others believed small, swallowed quantities would be eliminated or might even be beneficial. That uncertainty matters. The popular claim that every company knew from the first day exactly what lip pointing would do is too simple. It is also too simple to treat uncertainty as innocence that lasted indefinitely. By 1924, deaths and severe jaw injuries among former painters had become increasingly difficult to dismiss as isolated dental trouble. The United States Radium Corporation commissioned investigations. One early examination found no specific metallic poisoning. A separate team that included Cecil and Catherine Drinker of Harvard studied the orange plant and concluded that the illnesses were probably connected to radium exposure. Publication of their work was delayed at the company's request while litigation was developing. Then Harrison Martland, the medical examiner of Essex County, helped turn suspicion into measurable evidence. In 1925, Martland and his collaborators reported radiation coming from the bodies of dial painters and detected radon in their breath, a decay product of radium held inside them. The combination of jaw necrosis, severe anemia, and internal radioactivity established a new occupational disease. The mechanism explained why the danger had been so difficult to see. Much of the swallowed material passed through the digestive system, but some entered the bloodstream. Because radium behaves chemically like calcium, the body deposited part of it in bone, and once there, it continued irradiating the surrounding bone and marrow. Workers with heavy internal burdens could develop non-healing dental injuries, damaged jaws, anemia, weakened bones, and fractures. Other effects, including bone sarcomas and cancers in tissues near the skull, could emerge only after longer delays. By then, the women faced two clocks. One was medical. Their illnesses could progress faster than doctors could diagnose them or lawyers could prepare a case. The other was legal. New Jersey's 2-year statute of limitations had been designed for injuries that could be recognized near the time they occurred. Radium poisoning did not work that way. A woman could leave the factory feeling healthy, become ill years later, and discover that the legal deadline had expired before anyone could even explain what was happening to her. Grace Fryer refused to accept that trap quietly. She had worked at the orange plant and spent years searching for a lawyer willing to challenge the company. By 1927, Fryer had joined Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, Albina Larice, and Quinta McDonald in a widely publicized action against United States Radium. Their case depended on turning invisible contamination into evidence a court could recognize. Elizabeth Hughes, a physicist trained in radium measurement at the National Bureau of Standards, tested samples of the women's breath with an electroscope. Years after they had stopped painting dials, their bodies were still releasing radon. The women also faced a defendant with more money, greater access to experts, and something the women themselves increasingly lacked: time. United States Radium disputed causation and liability. Medical opinion had not moved in one direction all at once, and company-linked consultants challenged diagnoses even as other investigators strengthened the connection to radium. The women had to prove not only that they were sick, but that an unfamiliar disease had come from work they had performed years earlier. On June 8, 1928, the 5 women reached an out-of-court settlement. Each received $10,000, a $600 annual payment for life, and approved medical expenses. The agreement gave them immediate financial and medical support. But the company did not admit liability, and the legal trap created by delayed illness remained. Later cases showed just how severe that problem could be. In 1935, the LaPorte case concluded that United States Radium had not fraudulently concealed a danger it should have understood before 1924. The company was therefore allowed to rely on the 2-year statute of limitations. The court could recognize the horror of the disease while still concluding that some workers had waited too long to bring a claim, even when the danger itself had taken years to become understood. Several other claims were abandoned afterward, and the story was not confined to New Jersey. In Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company had employed another generation of young painters beginning in the early 1920s. By then, evidence from the New Jersey cases was becoming public. Yet Illinois workers continued to receive assurances about the material. Company examinations and medical information became another source of conflict. In later proceedings, the women's lawyer argued that workers had been denied access to the results of examinations performed on them. One of those workers was Catherine Wolfe Donohue. She had left Radium Dial in 1931. By the middle of the decade, she was gravely ill. Donohue and other former painters pursued compensation under Illinois law, confronting the same basic problem the New Jersey women had faced. Their disease appeared slowly. The legal clock did not. Illinois already had an occupational disease framework, but its reach and constitutionality had been contested. The legislature revised the law in 1936. In 1938, an arbitrator and the Illinois Industrial Commission found that Donohue's disability resulted from occupational radium poisoning and awarded compensation. By then, Donohue had become too weak to keep traveling to the hearings. The proceeding that would determine whether her illness came from her work had to continue inside her home. She died on July 27, 1938. The litigation continued without her. In 1939, the Illinois Supreme Court rejected Radium Dial's attempt to obtain review without posting the bond required to secure the compensation award. The United States Supreme Court later dismissed the company's appeal. Those decisions left Donohue's award standing, but they did not suddenly create modern workplace safety. Change came through many channels. Lip pointing was largely discontinued in the industry after the mid-1920s. Public health researchers, industrial hygienists, physicists, state officials, unions, reformers, physicians, and later radiation protection institutions developed better procedures and exposure standards. Dial painting itself continued, including during the Second World War. But it continued with knowledge and controls that sharply reduced workers' internal exposure. The cases also made occupational disease harder to treat as a private misfortune. They exposed a fundamental problem with injuries that appeared years after the work that caused them. They showed how a statute of limitations could expire while a disease was still developing, how employers could control access to medical information, and how a worker's ability to prove causation could depend on access to independent science. The dial painters also became one of the most important human populations studied in the development of standards for internally deposited radioactive materials. But the Radium Girls did not create workers' compensation. They did not create federal radiation regulation. They did not create the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And they did not create every modern workplace protection. Those systems emerged over decades through broader labor struggles, public health research, state legislation, federal action, wartime science, and later nuclear policy. Radium remained in luminous products long after the first lawsuits. Some contaminated sites outlived the companies that created them. The brush that once represented precision, modern employment, and a glowing new technology eventually became evidence of a deeper imbalance. Institutions could wait for scientific certainty. They could commission another report, contest another diagnosis, appeal another ruling. The women carried the uncertainty inside their bones, and many of them did not have time to wait for the argument to end. When knowledge is incomplete, but the cost of being wrong falls almost entirely on workers, who should have to prove that a workplace is safe?